We are absolutely delighted that you're joining us for this webinar. Um, Before we get started about the Doing Good Index, let me just tell you a little bit about the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society. We are a research and advisory organization headquartered in Hong Kong, but working across 18 Asian economies, 16 countries, plus Taiwan and Hong Kong. We do policy research, and the DGI is an example of that. We do applied research, and then we do bespoke research. Almost all of our work is available on our website, except for the commissioned pieces, and some of that also. If you haven't been to our website, I really encourage you to take a look at caps.org. We have recently revamped our Asian Knowledge Portal, which includes our work, but also the work of others around Asia. We want to shine a light on the really great thinking and work and activities that are happening in this dynamic region. We have on that website reports, studies, podcasts, including a new podcast that I'm doing on conversations on doing good with leading Asian philanthropists, videos, and our newsletter, Who's Doing Good, which you can sign up for. So please take a look and engage with us through our website and the Asian Knowledge Portal. We are delighted that hundreds of people are taking their time today to join us for this webinar. We think it's really important, and we agree. We're delighted that many of you seem to agree with us. Let me just go through some logistics. If you have a question, and we encourage questions, please write it in the Q&A box. Before you write your question, if you could put the country that you're coming from, that would be terrific. Our colleague, Anna Lotte, who you can't see, but you will hear, will read the questions, and we will respond to them after the presentation during the Q&A session. Feel free to put in a question at any point during the presentation. Also, for your information, this webinar will be recorded and will be available later on for all those people who didn't have a chance to join us live, but still would like to hear. So having said that, let's go ahead and get into the bulk of the work. As we all know, Asia is facing, not just Asia, the world, unprecedented challenges. In fact, unprecedented seems to be the word that's being used more often than any other word these days. We have extraordinary health challenges, as we know, as a result of COVID-19. We have economic challenges, which will, I think, only increase as we come out of the health crisis. And we have environmental issues as a result of climate change that have yet to be adequately addressed. Fortunately, the social sector has risen to the occasion, and many of us know examples of the social sector stepping up. And when I say social sector, I mean nonprofit, social enterprises, CSR, and philanthropy, both the money and the organizations that are working to address social issues. We know that the social sector is providing food, providing healthcare, providing medical services, providing emergency grants and loans, and working alongside government to support their initiatives to be able to help communities weather this really unprecedented storm. At the same time as doing the other work that it was already doing to address health and environmental and educational needs of the population and those most vulnerable. Many of you know that this is the second iteration of the Doing Good Index. The first one came out in 2018, and this one is obviously coming out this year. Our plan is to release the Doing Good Index every 2 years. Why are we doing the Doing Good Index? Well, let me just say that, because we're in a global pandemic, funding is more localized than ever before. And in order to address local issues, we need to increase local funding and support. And when we looked across Asia, we felt that there were some impediments to the unleashing of adequate funding from the private sector, individuals and companies. So the Doing Good Index really looks at those factors that enable or impede the flow of capital toward doing good. We want to be able to look at the levers that allow financial support and other types of support, goods, services, technical assistance to flow more readily. We also know that in Asia, we have what we call a fairly profound trust deficit on the social sector. So people are wary of giving money to organizations that they do not trust. And so the Doing Good Index looks for remedies and ways to mitigate the trust deficit so that we can allow the government, the private sector, and the social sector to work much more collaboratively together in an effort to really increase impact and solve our problems. The United States gives the equivalent of 2% a year of their GDP toward philanthropy. 2% of the 18 economies we studied is $587 billion a year, which, as this slide shows, is 12 times the amount of foreign aid flowing into Asia and a third of the cost in attaining the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We need to increase the amount of money being put into the system in Asia. As of right now, Asia as a region is on track to meet 0 of the Sustainable Development Goals. We must remedy this. So in addition to the crisis we're dealing with now, we have long-term problems that we need to address. The Doing Good Index really is an effort to figure out how to mitigate the trust deficit and remove obstacles to allowing capital to flow. The Doing Good Index shows us 3 different sets of how we can do it. 1, we talk about aligning incentives around doing good. What are those incentives and how do you maximize them? 2, as I just mentioned, measures that can mitigate the trust deficit, allow us to work more collegially together. And 3, to maximize private social investments flowing to the social sector. Mehvesh is going to go through the Doing Good Index and we're going to show you the different ways that these 3 sets of solutions can be maximized. So with that, I hand this over to Mehvesh.
Thank you very much, Ruth. So let's just take a little pause here before diving into these 3 buckets and toolkits for how we can maximize social investment across Asia, and actually explain briefly what the Doing Good Index is for those of you who may not be familiar with it. As Ruth mentioned, the Doing Good Index looks at the indicators and the factors that enable or hinder private social investment in Asia. And private social investment includes philanthropy, it includes corporate social responsibility, impact investing, and even as we speak, newer forms of social investment are also taking shape in Asia. And these factors can be broadly grouped into our 4 sub-indices. The first, regulations, looks at how easy is it, how efficiently can social sector organizations set up and operate? How easily can funds flow into and out of the sector? So how easy is it to receive or to give social investment? And finally, how transparent is the sector? What kind of accountability mechanisms are in place and how well are they communicated? The second part of the Doing Good Index looks at tax and fiscal incentives. And that means incentives for both givers, such as tax deductions and tax subsidies for giving, but also for recipients, which are mostly social sector organizations, and whether they are eligible for charitable tax exempt status, for example. And the reason we look at tax incentives is because they have a dual powerful effect in Asia, which I will discuss in just a couple of minutes. The third piece of the Doing Good Index is ecosystem. Ecosystem is societal embrace of how different actors and institutions are acting towards the social sector, how well they are engaging with the social sector. And it includes companies, universities, media, and last but not least, talent. And finally, procurement looks at how the government can legitimize and encourage social sector organizations to grow by actually contracting out social service delivery to them. So with this in mind, the Doing Good Index actually covers 18 economies in Asia. We base our findings and our insights on a survey of almost 2,200 social sector organizations that averages out about 120 per economy. Also, we interviewed, with the help of our partners, 145 experts, and that includes accountants, tax lawyers, policy makers, social sector leaders, to really get an accurate and complete picture of the situation in each economy. And this time in the 2020 Doing Good Index, we additionally have economy profiles that lay out the social sector and its evolution and upcoming trends for each economy, which were mainly authored by our partners. And we're very grateful to all our partners in these 18 economies for putting in the time and the effort to gather this data, which is completely original, has never been gathered before, and as anyone will tell you, is long surveys are very hard for people to fill. So we're very grateful to our partners for managing this and for truly coming along with this on our journey and owning it with us. Now let's talk about how these 18 economies perform on the Doing Good Index. And you can see from the slide that they fall into 4 clusters. And you can think about each cluster as signaling how many of the factors that can enable social investment are actually in place in these economies. So the economies that are doing well check most of the boxes in regulations, taxes, ecosystem, and procurement. Those that are doing better check fewer boxes, and those that are doing okay check even fewer, and those that are not doing enough right now actually have the longest distance to travel yet to check most of those boxes. But I want to discuss a little bit more about what each of these clusters means. So let's go into that. The economies that are doing well are Singapore and Taiwan. Now, both Singapore and Taiwan have enabling regulations and attractive tax incentives in place. For the Singaporeans who are joining us, I'm sure you know that Singapore has what we think is the highest rate of tax deductions, the highest tax subsidy for donations in the world, at 250%. So for every dollar given to charity by an individual or a company in Singapore, $2.50 of their income is tax-free. That is probably the highest tax subsidy in the world. Taiwan has a 100% tax subsidy, which is not bad at all either. Both of these countries have strong regulatory infrastructures in place that encourage the flow of social investment to the sector. The regulations are easy to understand and navigate. But let me pause here a second to say, although Singapore and Taiwan are doing well, they are not doing excellent, which is the missing 5th cluster of performance on the Doing Good Index. So even these economies that are leading in Asia can improve their performance. Singapore can engender more cross-sector collaboration and more community-originated initiatives. Taiwan is struggling with a talent recruitment and retention issue, which a lot of other Asian countries are as well. So even for these two, there is some room to travel and improve. Now let's look at the economies that are doing better. That's Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Most of them score above average on regulations and taxes and procurement, but it's ecosystem where their performance is mixed. The good thing about this variation is that these economies can actually learn from each other. So it presents an opportunity for learning. For example, Vietnam has a 100% tax deduction, tax subsidy, but also does not limit the income that is eligible for it. So Vietnam can be a good example for other economies in this group. The Philippines has amongst the most engaged corporate sector, where corporate representatives are sitting on nonprofit boards, are volunteering, are spearheading and leading and contributing to social sector organizations. And Pakistan is one of the few economies that has put in place a procurement body that really enables and encourages government investment and procurement from the social sector. So that's why these economies are here in the Doing Better group. Let's look at the biggest group, which is Doing Okay. Now, this group has actually gone from 3 economies in 2018 to 2020, and I'll explain a little in just now why that is. But interestingly, for these 8 economies, what is true is that the one thing in common is that there is not much in common that explains why they land here. We know that overall they all score around the same. That's why they're in this cluster. But the reasons for that scoring are different. China, for example, is in this group because fluctuating regulations is pulling it down in the regulation sub-index. India is struggling both on the regulation side, but also on the tax and fiscal side. Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand have actually dropped into this group from 2018 when they were doing better. And for Malaysia and Thailand, that's because of ecosystem where governance and trust are not as strong as they could be. In Sri Lanka, it's because of weaker tax incentives. And finally, 2 economies have actually entered this group from not doing enough, and those are Indonesia and Myanmar, who have actually improved their performance since 2018 because they've increased transparency in the sector and have put in place regulations that are more encouraging and enabling for social investment and social sector organizations. Just one final point here, it is worth noting that 4 out of the 8 economies in this cluster do have restrictions on the receipt of foreign funding. And this is something, again, we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. So the final group of performance on the Doing Good Index are those economies that are not doing enough. And these are Cambodia and Nepal. It's worth noting that they are the 2 newcomers to the index. And both have emerging philanthropic environments right now, which require improvement along multiple dimensions. Cambodia, for example, does not have a tax subsidy for individual donations. Nepal does not have a tax subsidy for corporate donations. In both these economies, the social sector organizations that we surveyed and the experts that our partners spoke to tell us that regulations are hard to understand and that they're also weakly enforced. So this gives you a sense of why economies have performed the way that they have on the Doing Good Index. So let's go back now to what Ruth spoke about earlier, which are the 3 sets of how-tos that the Doing Good Index talks about: how to align incentives, how to mitigate the trust deficit, and how to maximize private social investment. And the first of these is how to align incentives around doing good. And here we want to talk about aligning incentives through taxes, firstly. Secondly, aligning them through procurement, where government and the social sector works together. And thirdly, aligning incentives through recognition of doing good. So firstly, let's look at tax incentives. Now, tax incentives for giving and receiving really do help align incentives in the public sector, in the private sector, and the social sector, so that they work together towards meeting societal needs. And in Asia, we know that tax incentives have a real effect in pulling donations and contributions to the social sector. But in Asia particularly, they have a very strong signaling effect. When a government puts into place a 100% tax subsidy, it is signaling to companies and to donors that it supports donations flowing into the social sector. And in Asia, where governments and institutions tend to work in tandem, and where government signals really matter to companies, social sector organizations, individuals, this sends a strong message of encouragement and support for giving. So we cannot emphasize how important tax incentives are in Asia in particular. But the issue with tax incentives is that their potential is still held back. There's wide variation in the incentives available, as you can see from part of the tax table on this slide. Singapore has a 250% rate of tax deduction. A lot of the economies have 100% in the middle, and then Cambodia and Nepal have 0 for either individual or corporate. So countries have not yet aligned around really offering the best tax incentives that they can. The second thing is limit on income that is eligible for them holds them back. So even if your income, for every dollar you donate, you can take $1 of your income off the tax bill. If the limit on your income that is eligible for this is only 20%, which it is across Asia, the full effect of that tax incentive does not come into play. And finally, and this is a little more worrying, is that there is widespread confusion around tax incentives in Asia amongst everyone. Many of the social sector organizations that we surveyed were not aware of tax incentives in their economies. And even more surprisingly, in 14 out of these 18 economies, the experts that we interviewed and our partners interviewed were not aware or got the tax incentives wrong. So tax incentives are great, they are useful, they are particularly powerful in Asia. However, this confusion needs to be mitigated for their full impact to be unleashed. A second way that the government can help align incentives around giving and around supporting the social sector is by directly outsourcing social service delivery to the social sector through procurement. And we see this in Hong Kong, for example, where health services are often outsourced to the public sector, or in South Asia, where governments may set up schools, but then nonprofits come in to actually run them. And this allows, it's a win-win for government and the social sector. The government is able to leverage the networks and the reach of social sector organizations, while at the same time encouraging their growth and legitimizing them. So this is really quite important. And you can see that China and Bangladesh have the highest incidence of procurement with, in both countries, more than 50% of the social sector organizations that we interviewed were working with government to provide some social service or the other. And Thailand and Myanmar, on the other end of the spectrum, don't have much of a procurement incidence. Now, interestingly, we see between 2018 and 2020 that procurement is declining, and that's a trend that we would like to see reversed, and that we think will actually almost need to be reversed given the COVID crisis and the rebuilding that is required after that. Governments cannot do alone, companies cannot do alone, and the social sector cannot do alone. So it requires all of us to come together, and procurement is one way of making that possible and making these partnerships productive. And finally, recognizing doing good stimulates it. So recognition and awards are another way of aligning incentives to support the social sector. And here, most economies do very well. We see that all 18 economies have recurrent awards for philanthropy, and that 15 out of these 18 also recognize best-in-class corporate social responsibility, so corporate engagement, and best-in-class social delivery organizations and social innovation. 15 economies, again, have a National Volunteering Day to encourage society and people to engage more with the social sector. And although only 4 out of 18 have a National Giving Day that encourages the act of giving, everyone that we heard from across all economies felt that having a National Giving Day really does encourage recognition of the social sector and enhances engagement with it. So that's something we would encourage Asian economies to think about more. So this sums up how the Doing Good Index aligns incentives around doing good. Let's move on to how the Doing Good Index also helps equips us with tools and strategies to mitigate the trust deficit that holds engagement with the social sector back, and that holds private investment back at a time when we need even more of this homegrown private social investment. And the first thing that we see here is that regulations really help build accountability and transparency. Having rules and laws in place that require senior leadership to be held accountable, as it is in 16 out of these 18 economies, that require nonprofits to file annual reports and audited annual accounts, as is the case in 15 out of 18 economies, helps make the sector more transparent and accountable. And this is great news. However, we also know that a balance in regulations is important. in 10 out of 18 economies, fluctuating regulations are having a dampening effect. And I'm going to talk about this in just a little bit more. But just to round this point out by saying that the importance of trust and building trust cannot be understated. In 13 out of the 18 economies that we look at in the Doing Good Index, there were front page scandals related to the social sector in the last 2 years. And this has a real impact. In 1/3 of the organizations in these economies actually saw their funding decline as a direct result of this negative coverage. So this is something that we think regulations can help address, and we encourage these regulations to be in place. But if these regulations are changing too much, or they are not balanced, or they're put in place without having without planning exactly what the consequences are going to be, there can be a dampening effect. And this slide shows what happens when that is the case. So if you look at the average budget of a social sector organization, or a social delivery organization, as we call it, you'll see that 1/4 of it comes from foreign funding. Now, foreign funding was declining in 10 out of 18 economies even before COVID hit. And we know that this trend is likely going to be accelerated due to COVID. But in 6 of these 18 economies, this decline was directly due to a wariness around foreign funding. So restrictions were put in place in Bangladesh, China, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Vietnam. And as a result, social sector organizations in these economies were reporting funding declines of at least 20%. So while regulations can encourage transparency and accountability, they can also sometimes hinder or make it harder for social investment to flow to the sector. And especially now, when we need more of this investment to flow, then the Doing Good Index shows how this is possible. As Ruth likes to say, and as I like to steal this line from her, regulations are like cholesterol. There's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. And we really want to increase the good cholesterol in the sector without the bad cholesterol getting too much attention. Now, another way that the trust deficit can be mitigated, the Doing Good Index shows us, is by continuing engagement between the corporate sector and the social sector. So companies can really help build trust in the sector by firstly directly interacting with them. Familiarity automatically helps improve trust. But also they help build the capacity of the sector. What do I mean by that? So you'll see here that 3/4, 74% of social sector organization boards have members with corporate experience. These members, on an average board, that comes out to about 2 people with corporate experience out of a average board size of 9. These people are bringing with them a knowledge of governance practices and professional governance, which is welcome in the social sector. Then 51%, more than half of social sector organizations that we surveyed, host corporate volunteers. And what this does is it allows a skills transfer to occur between the corporate sector and the social sector, where corporate employees can bring in knowledge of accounting or legal and provide technical services and build this capacity and ability in the organization that they are volunteering for. So corporate engagement with the social sector helps build trust, and it is a win-win for both. And finally, empowering social sector organizations themselves also makes building trust easier. And we speak to donors here really when we see numbers like only 17% of social sector organizations are consistently getting capacity building support from donors. The more capacity building support that these organizations get, the more they are able to keep up with the regulatory requirements and to better tell their stories and build trust. Speaking of telling stories, only 1/3 of social sector organizations report donor support for communication expenses. And in today's world, where communication flows fast and furious online, it's very important for social sector organizations to also have the ability and the resources to get out there and to tell their stories. So we would encourage donors to support this. Universities, encouragingly, are looking at offering more and more courses and training around nonprofit management, and this is a welcome upward trend. In 2018, 681 universities were offering courses. In 2020, that has gone up to 818. And we hope that in 2022, we'll see an even higher number. But one of the factors to watch out for is the talent issue that this sector faces. Most organizations find it hard to recruit and retain talent. And we hope that as more universities train people for entering this sector, and as we see more people willing to engage, that should hopefully mitigate. But there is a perception out there that also holds talent back, and that is the perception that nonprofit staff should earn less than their for-profit counterparts. So we hope that the Doing Good Index helps shed light on the consequences of this perception, and hopefully how we can work together to change this. So finally, the third way that the Doing Good Index is telling us how we can all work together is by shining a light on maximizing private social investment. We know that funding for the social sector was already in flux, and that COVID, if anything, is going to make this funding even more challenging. So the time for spurring homegrown philanthropy, CSR, and impact investment is really now. And we've spoken to what governments can do and what companies can do, what donors can do, but the social sector itself can also take matters into its own hands in three ways. One, social sector organizations can build trust by being transparent, accountable, and communicative. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that there are some social sectors in Asia, such as Pakistan and the Philippines, where the social sector has actually come up with its own self-certification bodies that then signal to donors. All organizations that get certified from them signal to donors that these are trustworthy organizations. So they're not waiting for regulations to do that for them. They're taking matters into their own hands. Secondly, in building trust by being transparent and accountable, organizations can share their annual reports and accounts more widely. Another interesting thing we found when we collected data for the Doing Good Index was, although governments are requiring social sector organizations to submit annual reports and audited accounts, they're not necessarily making them public. So the public doesn't know that this organization is above board. And again, social sector organizations can do that themselves. And finally, they can really take control of telling their own stories. Technology makes that easier. Use of social media makes that easier. Again, encouragingly, we see a trend in our data that shows more organizations engaging with local media and recognizing the importance of social media. The second thing that social sector organizations can do is they can better leverage public-private partnerships. And our next study is on public-private partnerships. I'll let Ruth speak to that a bit more. And the reason is because this is a trend we think will also accelerate in a post-COVID world. Encouragingly, almost 3/4 of the organizations that we surveyed are actually already being involved in government policy consultations across Asia. So we would like to see this trend continue and see it coalesce into actual action. And finally, social sector organizations can really maximize the use of technology. And we see them putting this to good use when it comes to funding. Almost 2/3 of the organizations that we interviewed and surveyed intend to use crowdfunding, which is basically enabled by technology, to make up some of their funding shortfall. So from here on, I hope this was a brief but not too overwhelming summary of what the Doing Good Index tells us, and I will pass the baton back to Ruth to continue.
Thank you, Mehvesh. So I just want to go through and essentially mention the call to action that we hope that the Doing Good Index will provide. First, we have what governments can do. They can put into place the good cholesterol regulations. All of us in the social sector know that some regulations really allow us to be legitimate, to receive funding, and some are onerous and busy work that we can ill afford to take on. So good regulations are really important in our sector. Second, taxes. And as Mehvesh said, taxes are important Not so much. A lot of people don't even claim the tax subsidy, but they're important because of the signaling aspect. In Asia, much of the philanthropy and the corporate, both individual and corporate, tends to work aligned with government. And when government signals that we want engagement of this type, as the government in Taiwan and Singapore does well, then everyone is spurred on and encouraged to participate. What can businesses do? Obviously, businesses can provide funding. And we need them to step up and do so. But they also can provide skills. And as Mehvesh said, many nonprofits don't have the sufficient accounting, financial forecasting, IT, the kinds of skills that are available in almost any company are lacking in social sector organizations. So companies have an opportunity to transfer those skills. And companies can also engage in partnership. And as Mehvesh said, we see a rise in public-private partnership. Our next study is on the different types of public-private partnerships which exist in Asia. There are many different strategies, and we want to understand that better. So we are engaged in that study now. When it's done, I think we'll put on another webinar and maybe all of you can come back. And lastly, the social sector organizations. They need to be a lot better at working with others. Many social sector organizations look to government and look to corporates just fund us to do what we do, without trying to understand what the agenda is of the companies or the government. They need to be more aware of what a partnership looks like. A good partnership is a win-win, mutually beneficial partnership. And so that means that all the parties engaged in that need to really understand what the mutual benefit is and not just look to the other as just the solution to their problems. And social sector organizations can do much to build trust themselves. A great website with information about where the money's going, the impact that you're having, the stories that you bring to the table help to engender trust. And we encourage every organization to have a great website. So that's what the different organizations can do. Our problems today are complex. We need all hands on deck. And as has been reiterated throughout this presentation, funding is increasingly local. We saw a trend toward that even before COVID-19, but with the global nature of this pandemic, where outside funding is going to need to stay closer to home, it is incumbent on all the three sectors of our, in each of our countries and our communities to step up and work together to come up with innovative solutions and collaborative solutions. Today, the world is pretty grim, and there's a lot to be worried about. But if there is something that I can get hope from, it's examples like the number of people on this call today and the outstanding work that all of our partners are doing and the incredible work that philanthropists and companies are doing throughout the region. And if you want more proof of that, please make sure you get our newsletter, Who's Doing Good, which outlines all the work and the innovative activities and programs and projects that are happening across Asia. People are stepping up, companies are stepping up, and governments are starting to realize that the social sector, our sector, is an important, integral partner in solving our problems. And the extent to which we work together at the local level to really come up with solutions is the extent to which we're going to have better, healthier, cleaner, more sustainable lives. So we hope that people will use this Doing Good Index and the messages that we have in order to work with, on the ground in your countries, to engage with the sector you're not in and help to bring about an improved collaboration and social sector. We plan to have, we're working with our partners to create dissemination strategies in each of the economies in which we did our work. This one obviously was the big picture. We have more detail about what's happening in each of the 18 localities that we look forward to sharing in each of them, either live or remotely, depending on the circumstances. But this gives you a sense about the trends across the region, which are fairly consistent. We, the people on this call, are primarily from the social sector. It's tough, money's tough, the challenges are incredible, but we have an extraordinary opportunity, and I would say responsibility, to engage and continue our work to make the world a better place. So with that, I applaud all of you who are on the front lines of doing this important work. We hope that this study can help make your lives easier and lead to enhanced collaboration and enhanced impact. And with that, we'll go to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.